Victorian England is often regarded as the epitome of conservative values, social etiquette, and restraint. Does that mean the prolific drug use in that era was swept under the carpet? Hardly. Cocaine, opium, and cannabis could be bought over the counter in the Stevensons' day, and they were often used in home remedies, even for kids. From the affluent upper classes to the proud working class, mind-altering substances were handy household habits. Of course, alcoholism was also rife at all levels of Victorian society, the horrors of which touched Stevenson personally. In 1883, just a few years before Stevenson published Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, one of his oldest and dearest friends, Walter Ferrier, died from alcoholism at age 33. As we detail in our lesson on context, Robert Louis Stevenson was no stranger to drugs, especially opium, hashish, and cocaine. Is that why Stevenson looked like a bundle of sticks in a bag and always seemed restless? Or was that more to do with his fragile health? While writing The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson was dosed up on medicinal cocaine to treat suspected tuberculosis. Although he wasn't able to speak much, he thrashed out this novella, or short novel, in less than a week. So, Robert Louis Stevenson wasn't a Victorian prude, preaching to us from a sober high horse. He had a lot to say about drugs based on his own lived experience. Although, you might like to know that it wasn't drugs or tuberculosis that killed Stevenson at age 44. Instead, he reportedly suffered a massive stroke while making mayonnaise with his wife. But back to the point. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is often considered an allegory for drug abuse and addiction. An allegory is a narrative whose plot, characters, or setting are used to symbolise or represent real-world issues or events. Of course, a drug can be any medicine or substance, other than food, that changes a person's physical or mental state. So drug abuse is when someone uses a drug in excessive amounts or by methods that are harmful. Drug addiction, then, is a type of chronic, relapsing disorder. It's when a person has the constant, intense urge to use a drug, despite the consequences. When we consider the novella as an allegory for this, we can see the tragedy of Dr. Henry Jekyll's downfall. Born into London's elite, Dr. Jekyll is a celebrated professional. He uses his skills to do good in the community and is considered the very pink of proprieties. This is an English idiom, which is a peculiar expression that has a non-literal meaning. It characterises or depicts Dr. Jekyll as the ideal English gentleman. At least, that's what people thought. Dr. Jekyll is also handsome and robust, described as a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50. By contrast, Dr. Jekyll's other self, Mr. Hyde, is pale and dwarfish, hardly human, and troglodytic. Remember, a contrast is a strong difference. So the fact that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are nothing alike, yet one and the same, goes to show how drug abuse can really change a person. Stevenson chose Mr. Gabriel Utterson, Dr. Jekyll's old friend, to be the narrative point of view. In other words, the narrator tells us this harrowing story from Utterson's perspective. That way, we follow his genuine curiosity and concern as Dr. Jekyll seems to self-destruct. Of course, we don't find out the true cause of it until Utterson does at the end. When Utterson first starts poking around in Dr. Jekyll's private affairs, Stevenson uses visual imagery to portray Dr. Jekyll's panic. The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. This helps us imagine a mental picture of the way Dr. Jekyll's expression changes. It alters the tone or emotional atmosphere of the scene, creating tension between Utterson and Dr. Jekyll. Don't come between Dr. Jekyll and his potion. He assures Utterson that the moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. I can give you my hand upon that. The high modality, or highly certain and persuasive language in Dr. Jekyll's dialogue or conversation with Utterson makes it seem like he has his little habit under control. But Dr. Jekyll's new will mentions the possibility of his disappearance. So he's aware of the risk of being consumed by addiction, yet he still nurtures a very great interest in Mr. Hyde. The diacope in this admission, where the word great is repeated with only a few words in between, hints at Dr. Jekyll's large appetite for his drug. Within a year of this conversation, Dr. Jekyll's alter ego brutally murders someone, causing a public outcry. Utterson then finds Dr. Jekyll holed up in his study, looking deathly sick. This visual imagery portrays a man whose drug habit has finally caught up with him. In his dialogue with Utterson, Dr. Jekyll swears to God that his connection to Mr. Hyde is all at an end. Again, Stevenson uses high modality to portray how Dr. Jekyll swings between extremes. After this scare, Dr. Jekyll begins a new life, comes out of his seclusion, becomes a familiar guest, an entertainer, and is even distinguished for religion. The hopeful tone in these descriptions depict Dr. Jekyll as born again into sobriety. Sadly, he relapses after a few months and becomes an inscrutable recluse. From this point, Stevenson delivers a more epistolary style of narrative based on intriguing letters and top-secret documents. In a darkly mysterious letter to Utterson, Dr. Jekyll advises that he intends to lead a life of extreme seclusion and that his friends must suffer him to go his own dark way. Dr. Jekyll is now fighting for his life, and he's doing it alone. Does he have a choice? When Utterson and Enfield see Dr. Jekyll at his window by chance, he appears to have an infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner. The hyperbole of infinite sadness emphasises the doctor's pitiful state. It's an exaggerated statement, not meant to be taken literally, and vividly portrays Dr. Jekyll's sense of defeat. This is the last time that Utterson sees his dear friend alive. The use of hyperbole is also consistent with the emotional extremes of Gothic horror stories. Likewise, the terror of imprisonment is another trope or recognisable idea that's frequently used in this genre. Stevenson portrays Dr. Jekyll as trapped by his addiction. It takes over his life, robbing him of his choices, his identity, and eventually his life. In the end, all that's left behind are the sorely contorted and still twitching remains of Mr. Hyde. This symbolises how Dr. Jekyll was totally consumed and wretchedly transformed by his addiction. What Utterson and Poole also find at the scene are various measured heaps of some white salt. This is the key ingredient in Dr. Jekyll's potion and an allusion or reference to the powdered forms of highly addictive drugs that were so popular in Victorian times. Well, they're still popular, but they're now highly illegal for good reasons. Dr. Lanyon's narrative is the initial epistolary revelation about Dr. Jekyll's secret life. Dr. Lanyon describes how Mr. Hyde showed up at his house, desperate for a hit. The kinaesthetic imagery of the way he sprang towards his drugs depicts Hyde's frantic movements. Then, after drinking the potion at one gulp, the horror of his transformation is enough to shock Dr. Lanyon, literally, to death. Then we have Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case, the posthumous epistolary confession that spills the sordid details of Dr. Jekyll's ordeal. Owing to his lifelong yearning to dissociate the two sides of his identity, the mostly good and the wholly evil, Dr. Jekyll managed to compound a drug that helped him achieve this. He then drank it, even though he knew well that he risked death by overdose. Once the agony of transformation subsided, Dr. Jekyll was gripped by euphoria. Stevenson uses sensory imagery to depict how it was indescribably new and incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body, and it braced and delighted me like wine. Remember, sensory imagery is the use of words to help the audience imagine the sight, sound, touch, taste, or smell of something. Interestingly, this echoes Thomas de Quincey's description of the abyss of divine enjoyment when he first tried opium. He soon became dependent on it and, since withdrawal was hell, used it for the rest of his life. Stevenson uses the familiar metaphor of slavery to describe Dr. Jekyll's deep attachment to the drug. Remember, a metaphor is when one thing is described as something else, even though it isn't literally true. Dr. Jekyll's enslavement to the drug was actually a source of pleasure for many months. That is, until the transformations into Hyde became involuntary, and Dr. Jekyll had to take larger quantities of the drug to remain himself. Stevenson frequently uses biblical allusions, or references to the Bible, to describe Dr. Jekyll's drug-fueled destruction. In particular, the book of Genesis, where Adam and Eve are tempted by Satan and fall from God's grace. Likewise, Edward Hyde is described as really like Satan, and Dr. Jekyll refers to him as my devil. Jekyll also admits that, in my case, to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. This characterises Dr. Jekyll as an ordinary secret sinner, desperate to repent but failing miserably. This reflects the culture of Victorian England, where drug addiction was regarded as more of a moral issue than a medical one. Ultimately, the once celebrated Dr. Jekyll is reduced to a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak both in body and mind. The zoomorphic imagery of this creature offers a mental picture of Dr. Jekyll as having animal features, a far cry from the large, well-made, smooth-faced man he used to be. Dr. Jekyll's addiction stripped him of his humanity, reducing him to a sickly thing that waits for its true hour of death. Poor Dr. Jekyll. What a terrible fate. Perhaps he should have opened up to Utterson much earlier. If one of your friends was struggling to kick a habit, could you be their Utterson? We hope you enjoyed this schooling online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.